Imagine being 18 years old, dressed in a flame-cold wedding veil, thinking you're walking into a night of celebration, and instead being led into a room full of strangers, slaves, witnesses, and a silent physician waiting for you. You were told this was a tradition. You were never told you would be examined. You were never told your body would be documented. And you definitely were never told the ceremony would involve a wooden figure standing in the corner beneath a heavy cloth. A figure everyone in the room already knew the purpose of. In a few minutes, you'll understand why the cloth is there. In a few minutes, you'll understand why your mother cried while fixing your hair that morning. And in a few minutes, you'll realize your wedding night isn't about love at all. It's about verification. This isn't fiction. This was marriage in ancient Rome, a ritual so disturbing that Roman historians avoided describing it directly, and early Christians tried to wipe it from memory entirely. By the time that cloth is lifted, Livy will learn the truth behind the ceremony. Rome hoped the world would forget, and you will too. The year was 89 CE. The emperor ruled Rome with iron certainty, and 18-year-old Livia Tirsa was about to discover that Roman marriage had two faces: the public one, saffron veils, scattered walnuts, cheerful songs, and the hidden one, performed behind sealed doors in front of people who might one day be called to repeat every detail before a magistrate. What she was about to endure was a ritual so uncomfortable that ancient Roman historians avoided describing it directly, and one that Christian writers later attempted to wipe from memory entirely. Let's begin. Before this night, before the witnesses and the cloth-covered figure, the day had begun with beauty. Her wedding procession had been almost dreamlike. Livia wore the traditional flame-cold veil, the flammium, marking her unmistakably as a bride. Her hair had been arranged at dawn, parted with a spearhead, and woven into 6 braids secured with woolen ribbons. Every detail followed strict ancestral practice. At the temple, the sacrifice went smoothly. The priest had read favorable omens from the sheep's entrails. Her father had recited the ancient formula that transferred her from his legal authority to her husband's, and she had spoken the words generations of brides had whispered before her. Ub tub gus ego, where you are gus I am Gia, a vow announcing that she no longer belonged to herself. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a wealthy grain merchant, 25 years older, had met her only 3 times before that day. Yet by law, the ceremony had already made her his. Or rather, it had started the process. Because in Rome, the ritual in public was only the beginning. The truly binding moment waited at the end of the torchlit procession through the city. Inside a house she had never entered, surrounded by people she had not agreed to meet. The crowds lining the streets had sung the traditional Fescine verses, crude, explicit, deliberately embarrassing, meant to amuse the gods and keep evil spirits at bay. Young men shouted suggestions through the veil that made Livia's face burn with humiliation. Her mother had told her the songs were harmless, meant to protect her. But Livia had seen her mother's trembling hands while fixing her hair that morning. She had seen the tears her mother tried to hide, and she remembered the final warning whispered into her ear. Do not resist. Whatever they ask of you, do not resist. It only makes everything harder. By the time they reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus, the last traces of daylight were gone. The doorway had been decorated with wreaths of greenery and wool. 2 blazing torches marking it as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to ancestral law. The crowd singing grew louder. Someone held walnuts at her as a fertility blessing, the shells catching in the folds of her dress and scratching her skin. It felt more like ridicule than blessing. Marcus waited in the doorway, and behind him, Livia could make out movement. Too many silhouettes, far more people than she expected. Tradition required that her husband lift her over the threshold to avoid the omen of stumbling, but the gesture was older than that. It echoed a time when brides did not walk willingly into their husbands' homes at all. Once the door shut behind her, muffling the songs outside, Livia finally saw who had been waiting in the atrium. An elderly woman in ceremonial robes. the Paruba, whose duty was to oversee every moment of the night, a priest of unclear affiliation, 3 female slaves holding basins and cloths, an older man with a leather pouch containing medical instruments, and in the corner, partly hidden beneath draped linen, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The Paruba approached and clasped Livia's hands, her grit firm enough to prevent escape. "Welcome to your husband's house," she said. "The sacred rites must now be completed." Few people speak honestly about what Roman marriage truly was. It was not romantic, not sentimental, not a celebration of 2 souls. It was a transaction, a legal transfer of authority, witnessed and documented as carefully as the sale of farmland or livestock. Under the oldest Roman laws, a wife passed fully into her husband's control, placed in manu, literally in his hand. He held the same legal power over her that he held over his slaves, even the theoretical right to judge life and death. By the early imperial era, when Livia walked through that doorway, the laws had softened on the surface. Women could own property, divorce was possible, some aspects of paternal power had changed, but the foundation remained. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's legal control to another, and like all major transfers in Rome, this one required confirmation. Think of how Romans handled land sales. Witnesses observed. Rituals invoked divine approval. Boundaries were inspected and walked. Documents were sealed. Nothing was assumed. Everything was verified. Romans applied the same logic to marriage with one grim twist. The property being transferred was a human body, and that body's ability to produce legitimate heirs was the asset being purchased. So, Roman law required both the bride's virginity and the consummation of the marriage to be verified before the union was considered complete. Not rumored, not assumed, verified. And the rituals designed to achieve that verification, the ones Livia was about to face, were ones that very few ancient writers dared to describe directly, because even in Rome, they were considered unspeakably intimate. Livia stood trembling beside the shrouded wooden figure, unaware that what happened next would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. A ritual so disturbing that later generations would try desperately to pretend it had never existed, at all. Roman law was uncomfortably clear on one point. A marriage did not exist legally or socially until the union was physically completed. And it was not enough for the husband and wife to simply say it had happened. There had to be confirmation, observation, and testimony. Without witnesses, the entire marriage could be challenged. Without verification of the bride's virginity, the legitimacy of future children could be questioned. For Rome, that uncertainty was unacceptable. So, the Romans created rituals. Rituals that fit perfectly within their legal worldview and feel disturbingly unimaginable to ours. The Paruba tightened her grip on Livia's arm and guided her toward the veiled structure in the corner. Livia's heart hammered so loudly she could feel its rhythm in her throat. She sensed that whatever stood beneath that cloth would change everything about her life, her body, her beliefs. But there was no path backward now. "You must greet mutinous Tutinus," the Paruba murmured, her voice steady but her fingers firm. "You must seek his blessing before your husband may approach. The gods must witness your submission." Livia swallowed hard, her breath trembling. She had never heard of this god before, and she had no idea what greeting him truly meant. Her hands shook as she reached for the draped fabric. The witnesses leaned closer. Even the slaves stopped moving. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. When Livia pulled the cloth away, she understood why. Standing beneath the covering was a wooden figure carved with uncomfortable anatomical accuracy into the shape of a phallic idol. But it was not a tiny charm like the pendants children wore for luck. It was not a crude scare figure placed in gardens to ward off intruders. It was deliberate, intentionally proportioned, built for one purpose. And that purpose became terrifyingly clear the moment the Paruba began to explain. Mutinous Tutinus was Rome's shadowy deity of initiation and fertility. Ancient authors mention him only briefly, and always with a sense of embarrassment, as if the very name felt indecent. Augustine, writing centuries later as Christianity tightened its grip on Rome, described the ritual with fury and disgust. Roman brides were required to sit upon the god's emblem before lying, with their husbands, and they did so in front of witnesses. He condemned the practice, but he did not invent it. Other early Christian writers referenced the same rite, hinting that it was too shameful to describe openly. Arnobius claimed brides were made to straddle the symbol while their new spouses watched. Lactantius argued that speaking of it polluted the tongue. Even Varro, a pagan scholar centuries earlier, mentioned brides being presented to mutinous Tutinus with phrasing that suggested physical contact, though he carefully avoided detail. Modern historians, uncomfortable with the implications, often downplayed the descriptions, suggesting perhaps brides only sat lightly on the statue's lap in some symbolic gesture. But the ancient language does not support this softer interpretation. Augustine used incidere, a word meaning to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius's phrasing suggested penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details at all, something unlikely if the act had been a mere symbolic touch. The official explanation, of course, was fertility. The unspoken purpose might have been something else: to break down resistance, to demonstrate submission before witnesses, to prepare a virgin bride for what the law required next. Livia stood frozen before the wooden god, the flickering lamplight throwing its grotesque silhouette across the wall. The pruba moved behind her, adjusting her posture, arranging her body, guiding her without gentleness. The witnesses watched in absolute silence. Her husband watched. The physician waited behind them, hands clasped, prepared for what came next. And in that moment, Livia finally understood the meaning of her mother's trembling warning. The obscene street songs, the secrecy, the dread. She understood what being a Roman wife would truly demand. Technically, she could refuse, but refusal meant the marriage contract would collapse. She would return to her father's home, not as an honorable bride, but as a discarded woman. Damaged, untouchable, unmarriageable. She would disgrace her family. She would become a source of shame, whispered about at dinner tables. Her life, as she knew it, would be over, so she did not refuse. When the ritual ended, slaves approached with warmed scented water. They washed her carefully, murmuring prayers intended to purify her after her contact with the god. But the cleansing had a second purpose, a more practical one. It prepared her for the examination. The physician, who had been watching silently, now stepped forward, and Livia felt her stomach drop. This part, too, was not optional. In marriages involving wealth, lineage, or political standing, Roman brides underwent medical verification before the ceremony. A midwife or physician documented the bride's virginity. The records of that examination could later decide disputes about inheritance or legitimacy. The texts preserved by Roman medical writers, cruel in their precision, leave no doubt about what the examination involved. That first examination, conducted earlier, established the starting point. It declared Livia untouched, an asset unaltered as Roman law sighed. Now came the second examination. This one checked that the ritual with mutinous Tutinus had been carried out, that the physical signs matched earlier documentation, that she was, according to Roman logic, ready. Everything occurred with the witnesses present. Their statements could later be demanded in court if the marriage was ever challenged, and not one person in that room seemed to feel the slightest discomfort about what was being done to her. Modern readers recoil at these descriptions. What feels invasive, humiliating, and traumatic to us was to Romans simply a matter of legal procedure. The bride's comfort did not factor into the equation. Her emotions were as irrelevant as the feelings of a field being surveyed before sale. Property did not have feelings. Property was transferred, and the procedures had to be followed. When the examination was finally complete, the pruba led Livia toward the bedchamber prepared for the consummation. The room was arranged exactly as tradition required. The bed was positioned so that it could be easily seen from the doorway, because that doorway by custom would remain open through the night. Oil lamps burned steadily, casting enough light for the pruba to observe without interruption. Slaves waited nearby to assist afterward. Every part of the room felt staged, arranged, prepared for a ritual Livia could not escape. Marcus entered at last. He paused at the doorway, glanced at the watching pruba, and stepped toward the bed. His face betrayed something Livia did not expect. Not confidence, not desire, but unease, as if even he understood that what was about to happen was not an act of intimacy. It was an act of verification, and the night was only beginning. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, and that alone startled Livia. She had expected a man confident, assured, even dominant, someone who knew exactly what this night demanded. Instead, he glanced quickly toward the pruba as if seeking approval or permission, a faint flush of embarrassment crossing his face before he approached the bed. The pranuba lifted her chin, her voice formal and heavy with ritual authority. The bride is made ready. The gods have witnessed her submission. Let the union be completed according to the customs of our ancestors. Let those present affirm the act. Let no doubt remain that this woman has become a wife. Her tone left no room for hesitation. What followed unfolded slowly, hour by hour, under the unblinking eyes of those assigned to observe. The pranuba stood watch from the doorway, stepping forward only when tradition required instruction, occasionally adjusting something, occasionally correcting Livia's posture or Marcus' approach, ensuring that every part of the consummation aligned with legal expectation. The door stayed open, lamplight spilled into the corridor. Anyone in the household could hear the movements, the voices, the ritual commands. Every sound was part of the documentation, part of the evidence. Nothing about that night was private, nothing was meant to be. For Livia, the bedsheets might as well have been parchment, and her body, the ink Rome demanded to finalize the contract. Everything that happened was a form of verification. One last step to make the transfer of authority unchallengeable. By dawn, the air felt heavy, the lamps burned low, and the physician returned. He stepped inside with the same clinical detachment he had shown earlier. His task was simple: confirm that consummation had occurred, and that Livia now bore the physical marks expected of a woman who had crossed from virgin to wife. Disexamination was recorded. The pranuba gave her sworn testimony. Witnesses nodded in acknowledgement. The legal transformation was complete. Livia Tersa, barely 18, was now officially a Roman wife. Her role, her identity, her future had all been reshaped within a single night. She would go on to have children for over the next decade. She would oversee her husband's household, host dinners, manage slaves, perform religious duties, and carry herself with the composure expected of a matron. To the outside world, she would appear dignified, capable, respectable. But about her wedding night, she would speak to no one, not even her own daughters. There were no words for it, and in truth, she had never heard another woman speak of theirs either. Livia's silence was not unusual, it was universal. Women of her world did not record these experiences. Men did not document them in personal detail. The rituals were so deeply embedded into the structure of marital life that describing them would have seemed unnecessary, like explaining daylight or breathing. Everyone already knew, and yet no one spoke. That is why historians today struggle to reconstruct what truly happened behind closed doors in ancient households. Much of what we know comes from fragments, angry denunciations by Christian writers, shreds of legal commentary, offhand references in medical treatises, and archaeological hints, whose meaning becomes clear only when placed beside these scattered texts. The absence of detailed accounts is not evidence of conspiracy, it is evidence of familiarity. The rituals were the water. Roman women swam in so omnipresent that describing them felt pointless. For nearly 1,000 years, this was marriage in Rome. Generations of brides walked the same torchlit paths. Generations of mothers whispered the same warnings. Generations of young women endured the same night, the same witnesses, the same scrutiny. The system endured because everyone, men, women, families, priests, accepted its logic. Property had to be verified. Legal transfers required witnesses. Marriage produced legitimate heirs and therefore needed proof. Women were the conduit through which family lines continued. It made sense within itself, even as it feels monstrous to us. The end of these practices did not come from Rome deciding it had gone too far. It came from outside, from the spread of Christianity and the transformation of Roman values. 4th and 5th centuries. With new theology came new assumptions. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated merely as property. If marriage was a sacred sacrament, it could not include rituals the church deemed obscene. If modesty was a virtue, The presence of witnesses during consummation became intolerable. The shift was not instant, it was not easy, it was not complete. But gradually, across cities and elite households, the old ceremonies were abandoned or reshaped beyond recognition. And with them went the evidence. Statues of mutinous Tutinus were smashed or buried. Texts referencing the wedding night rituals were quietly removed from libraries or left to decay. Wall paintings hinting at the rites were plastered over. The pruba's duty shrank from active supervisor to symbolic attendant. Within a few generations, the full knowledge of what Roman weddings had once required vanished, remembered only dimly in obscure manuscripts read by curious scholars centuries later. The Christians who reshaped Rome were not merely scrubbing away embarrassing details. They were forging a new civilization atop the ruins of the old while refusing to acknowledge what those ruins had once supported. They succeeded almost completely. Today, most people imagine Roman marriage as saffron veils, festive songs, and scattered walnuts. A charming blend of ritual and romance. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Livia Tarsa died around 31 CE, roughly 60 years old. She had been a wife for more than 4 decades. She had raised children. She had fulfilled every expectation placed upon her. But what did she remember when she thought of her wedding night? Did she relive the fear, the shame, the powerlessness? Did she make peace with it over time? Did she hope her daughters would endure something milder? Or did she accept it as unchangeable, simply the way things were? We cannot know. She left no written record. Roman women of her standing were not expected to. The silence surrounding these rituals comes from women whose experiences were never considered important enough to preserve, whose bodies were central to legal systems, yet whose thoughts were irrelevant to the histories men wrote. We know what was done to them, we rarely know what they felt. Yet we know enough to understand why generations tried so hard to erase this aspect of Roman life. Rome is often idealized as the foundation of Western law, order, and civilization. But acknowledging what Rome demanded of its women complicates that story. It shows us that brutality and refinement can coexist, that legal sophistication can operate alongside systematic dehumanization. The rituals are gone, but the women who endured them were real. For Livia, for her mother, for her daughters, for countless unnamed brides whose wedding nights were rituals of control, scrutiny, and verification, they lived, they endured, and they were silenced.